Sometimes the people who need saving most are the ones who think they're beyond redemption. In the frozen wilderness of Glacier Valley, Montana, where the wind cuts through a man's soul as sharp as his regrets, Sam Hartwell has spent 2 decades punishing himself for sins that won't stay buried. The 58-year-old rancher lives alone on 800 acres of unforgiving land, his only companions the ghosts of Vietnam and a bottle of whiskey that never seems to empty fast enough. But on this particular December night in 1987, as a blizzard tears across his property with the fury of nature unleashed, Sam discovers something that will shatter his carefully constructed world of isolation. In his stable, curled up in the hay like a wounded animal, lies a teenage girl with burns covering her arms and secrets buried in her eyes. She knows things no stranger should know, where his son used to hide, what his wife whispered before she left, why he came home from the war broken. As Sam finds himself caring for this mysterious child, he begins to wonder if she's his salvation or his final descent into madness. What happens when the past refuses to stay dead, and the only way forward is through a truth too impossible to believe? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The girl stirred in the hay as Sam's flashlight beam found her face, and for a moment he thought he was seeing things, a trick of the storm maybe, or the whiskey finally catching up to him. But then she opened her eyes, pale blue like winter ice, and looked directly at him without fear or surprise. "You're late," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind howling through the stable walls. Sam's weathered hands tightened on the flashlight. In 58 years, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him to back away. But the girl couldn't be more than 16, wearing nothing but a thin cotton dress that should have left her frozen solid in this storm. Her feet were bare, dirt-stained, and somehow unmarked by frostbite, despite the sub-zero temperatures. "Late for what?" he managed, his voice rusty from disuse. The bourbon he'd been nursing all evening seemed to evaporate from his bloodstream, leaving him sharp and alert in a way he hadn't felt in months. She sat up slowly, hay falling from her dark hair, and Sam caught sight of the burns covering her forearms, old scars, raised and twisted like rope. The marks were deliberate, purposeful, forming patterns that made his stomach turn. "You always check the horses when the storms get bad," she said matter-of-factly. "Every winter, same as when Tommy was little, he used to follow you out here with that red flashlight, remember? The one with the broken switch that only worked if you held it just right." The blood in Sam's veins turned to ice water. Nobody knew about Tommy's flashlight. His ex-wife Sarah had thrown it away years ago, along with everything else that reminded her of their son. And yet this stranger spoke about it like she'd been there, watching from the shadows of his memories. "How do you know that name?" The words came out harder than he intended, his military training kicking in despite the years of trying to bury it. "Who are you?" "I told you. I'm Luna." She stood with fluid grace, brushing hay from her dress like this was the most natural conversation in the world. "And you're Sam Hartwell, Vietnam veteran, 173rd Airborne Brigade. You came home in 1969 with shrapnel in your left leg and nightmares that never end. Your son died when he was 8, and your wife left because she couldn't stand watching you drink yourself to death." Each word hit him like a physical blow. Sam stumbled backward, his hip striking the stable door hard enough to rattle the frame. The pain grounded him, reminded him this wasn't another whiskey-fueled hallucination. "That's impossible," he whispered. "There's no way you could—" "The treehouse," Luna interrupted, taking a step toward him, "behind the old oak on the north pasture. Tommy built it the summer before he got sick, but he never told anyone about it. Not even Sarah. It's still there, isn't it? Rotting away where nobody looks." Sam's knees nearly gave out. He'd found that treehouse 3 years ago while mending fence, had stood beneath it for an hour before finally climbing up to sit in the place where his son had dreamed his 8-year-old dreams. He'd never told a soul about it, not his brother, not the therapist Sarah had begged him to see, not anyone. "Please," Luna said. and for the first time her composure cracked slightly. "I don't have much time. They're looking for me, but not in the way you'd think. And there are things you need to know before they find me." The storm raged outside, battering the stable with ice and fury, but Sam barely heard it over the pounding of his heart. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible, that grief and guilt and too many years of drowning his sorrows had finally driven him over the edge. But Luna's eyes held a weight that belonged to someone much older, and the way she stood, perfectly still despite the cold, wasn't quite human. "What things?" he heard himself ask. Luna smiled then, sad and knowing, about the fire, about the children who died, about why you really came back to Montana after the war. She tilted her head, studying his face with an intensity that made him want to hide. "You remember, don't you? The smoke in the sky, the sirens in the distance. You were on leave, driving through the reservation, and you saw it happening, but you didn't stop." The memory hit him like a sucker punch. December 1967, 3 weeks before he shipped out for his second tour. The house engulfed in flames, silhouettes moving behind the windows, and his younger self behind the wheel of his father's truck, frozen with indecision until it was too late to matter. 4 children, Luna continued softly. 3 girls and a boy. The oldest was 16. Sam's flashlight slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering to the stable floor and casting wild shadows across the walls. In the dancing light, Luna's scars seemed to writhe like living things. "You were one of them," he whispered. "I was," she confirmed. "And now I'm here." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the storm's relentless assault on the stable walls. Sam's mind reeled, grasping for any explanation that didn't involve him finally losing what remained of his sanity. 20 years since that fire, and he'd built his entire life around forgetting that moment of cowardice. "This isn't real," he said, more to himself than to Luna. "You're not real." But even as the words left his mouth, he could smell her, not the hay and horse sweat of the stable, but something else. Smoke. Ash. The acrid scent of things that shouldn't burn. Luna stepped closer, and Sam found himself backing toward the stable door. His leg, the one with the shrapnel that still ached before storms, nearly buckled beneath him. The pain was real enough, the cold seeping through his jacket was real. But this girl, this impossible girl with her ancient eyes and burned arms. "You need to go inside," he said finally, his voice rough. "Get warm. We'll figure this out in the morning." "There might not be a morning," Luna replied. "Not for me." But she followed him anyway, her bare feet silent on the frozen ground as they crossed the yard to his house. Sam's hands shook as he fumbled with the lock, not from cold, but from the weight of her presence behind him. He could feel her watching, waiting, and it reminded him of the nights in the jungle when he'd known Charlie was out there in the darkness. The house welcomed them with stale air and the lingering smell of his dinner. Canned soup heated on a burner that needed replacing. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it 2 hours ago. The empty bourbon bottle on the kitchen counter, the television still playing static to an empty living room, the pile of unopened mail from his brother David that he'd been avoiding for weeks. This was his life, had been his life for the better part of 2 decades, a slow, quiet decay in a house too big for one broken man. Luna moved through the rooms like she belonged there, her fingers trailing over surfaces with familiar ease. She paused at the mantelpiece, studying the single photograph that remained. Sam and Tommy at a county fair, both grinning at the camera with matching gaps in their teeth. Sarah had taken all the others when she left, but she'd missed this one, hidden behind a larger frame. "He looks happy here," Luna observed. "He was 8, Sam said, hanging his jacket on a chair that had been Tommy's favorite spot for homework. "Everything was still possible when you're 8. You were a good father. Before." The words hit harder than any accusation. Before the drinking, before the nightmares started bleeding into his waking hours, before he'd lost the ability to look at his son without seeing the faces of all the children he hadn't saved, in Vietnam, on the reservation, in a dozen other moments when he'd frozen instead of acted. "You don't know anything about what kind of father I was." Luna turned from the photograph, and in the lamplight, her scars were even more pronounced. "I know you taught him to fish in Miller's Creek. I know you read him stories about knights and dragons. I know that when he had nightmares, you'd sit with him until dawn because you understood what it meant to be afraid of the dark." Sam's throat closed. Those were private memories, sacred things he'd never shared with anyone. Not even Sarah knew about the stories, the made-up adventures he'd whispered to Tommy during the long nights when leukemia had stolen his son's sleep. "Stop," he whispered. "I know you still set a place for him at Christmas dinner, even though no one comes. I know you keep his room exactly the way it was, down to the model airplane on the dresser. I know you blame yourself for his death, even though there was nothing you could have done. Stop it. And I know that's why you couldn't save us, because you'd already lost everything that mattered." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sam sank into his recliner, the one piece of furniture Sarah hadn't wanted, and put his head in his hands. His wedding ring, which he still wore despite the divorce papers gathering dust in a drawer, caught the light. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken. The wind no longer howled with quite the same fury, and the ice striking the windows had gentled to a steady patter. Dawn was still hours away, but Sam could feel the night shifting toward its inevitable end. "Why are you here?" he asked, without looking up. Luna settled onto the couch across from him, her movements careful and deliberate. "Because it's time, Sam. 20 years I've been waiting, and now they're coming for me, all of us. But first, you have to understand what really happened that night, what you saw, what you chose not to see. I saw children die. The words tasted like ash. I saw them burn, and I did nothing." "No," Luna said softly. "You saw something much worse than that." Sam's head snapped up, his eyes searching Luna's face for meaning. "What are you talking about?" Before she could answer, the house shuddered. Not from wind. This was something else entirely. The vibration seemed to come from beneath them, a low thrumming that made the windows rattle in their frames and caused the water in Sam's abandoned coffee mug to ripple in concentric circles. Luna's entire body went rigid. "They've found us." "Who's found?" The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The house plunged into absolute darkness, the kind Sam hadn't experienced since the jungle nights of his youth. Even the storm seemed to quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound of vehicles in his driveway. Sam rose from his chair, his soldier's instincts overriding 20 years of civilian softness. He moved to the window and peered through the curtains, but saw nothing except his own reflection staring back. No headlights, no engines running. Yet he could hear them, doors slamming, footsteps crunching through the snow, voices speaking in low, urgent tones. "Luna," he started, turning back toward the couch. She was gone. "Luna?" He felt his way through the darkness, hands outstretched like a blind man. The living room was empty, so was the kitchen. "Where are you?" A knock at the front door made him freeze. 3 sharp raps, perfectly spaced, official in their precision. "Mr. Hartwell?" The voice was male, authoritative, with the flat accent of someone trying to hide their origins. "We need to speak with you." Sam's mouth went dry. In 20 years of isolation, no one had ever come to his door in the middle of a storm. Hell, no one had come to his door at all except for David, and his brother always called first. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Mr. Hartwell, we know you're in there. We just want to talk." Sam backed away from the door, his injured leg protesting the sudden movement. His mind raced through possibilities: FBI, local law enforcement, military police tracking down some long-forgotten transgression from his service days. But none of those explanations felt right. This felt like something else entirely. Sam Luna's voice drifted down from upstairs, barely audible. "Don't open the door." He found her in Tommy's room, standing perfectly still beside his son's bed, with its faded Superman comforter and collection of baseball cards still scattered across the nightstand. The model airplane she'd mentioned, a P-51 Mustang Tommy had spent weeks building, sat exactly where his boy had left it before the final trip to the hospital. "Who are they?" Sam whispered. "The same people who've been looking for us since the fire." Luna's eyes reflected what little moonlight filtered through the curtains. "They're the reason we couldn't move on. The reason we've been trapped here for 20 years. The knocking had stopped, but Sam could hear them moving around outside, circling the house, testing windows, searching for another way in. Professional, methodical, military. What do they want? What they've always wanted, to finish what they started that night." Luna sat on the edge of Tommy's bed, and for a moment she looked every bit the frightened 16-year-old girl she appeared to be. "The fire wasn't an accident, Sam. We didn't die because of faulty wiring or a forgotten candle. We were murdered." The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Sam sank into the small chair beside Tommy's desk, the same chair where he'd once helped his son with homework and listened to excited recountings of playground adventures. "That's impossible. The investigation was buried along with us." Luna's voice carried a bitterness that belonged to someone much older. 4 native children dead in a house fire on the reservation in 1967? Nobody asked too many questions. Nobody wanted to know the truth. Footsteps on the roof now. Whoever they weren't giving up. "But you saw," Luna continued. "That's why you couldn't stop, why you drove past without helping, because some part of you recognized what was really happening." Sam closed his eyes, forcing himself back to that December night. He'd been 21, home on leave before shipping out for Vietnam. The memory came in fragments, the house ablaze against the winter sky, dark figures moving in the shadows beyond the firelight, the wrongness of it all that had made him press harder on the accelerator instead of stopping to help. "I was a coward," he said. "No." Luna stood, moving toward Tommy's window. "You were scared, and you were right to be. They would have killed you too." A new sound made them both freeze, the soft scrape of someone jimmying the lock on the back door. They were coming inside. Luna turned to face him, her young features set with grim determination. "You have a choice to make, Sam. You can let them take me, like you let them kill us 20 years ago, or you can finally do what you should have done that night." "What are you asking me to do?" "Fight," she said simply. "Help me find the others. Help us finish this." The back door opened with a quiet click. Sam's hands trembled as he stared at Luna, her words echoing in the darkness of his dead son's room. Fight. The concept felt as foreign to him now as breathing underwater. He'd spent 20 years running from fights, drowning his conscience in bourbon and isolation, letting the world shrink down to nothing more than cattle and solitude. "I can't," he whispered, the admission scraping his throat raw. "You don't understand what you're asking. I'm not that man anymore." The footsteps downstairs grew bolder now, no longer concerned with stealth. Sam could hear them spreading through his house, his sanctuary, with practiced efficiency. One in the kitchen, another in the living room, a third moving toward the stairs. How many were there? How had they gotten past his locked doors so easily? Luna's eyes never left his face. "You're exactly that man. You've always been that man. That's why you've spent 20 years punishing yourself." "You're wrong." Sam's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Vietnam proved that. Tommy's death proved that. I freeze when it matters. I always freeze." The first heavy footstep landed on the bottom stair, then another. "They're coming up," Luna said quietly, but she made no move toward the window, no attempt to flee. Instead, she sat back down on Tommy's bed, her scarred hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for Sunday service to begin. "You have maybe 30 seconds to decide who you want to be." Sam's chest tightened until he could barely breathe. The familiar weight of failure pressed down on him. Every moment he'd hesitated, every time he'd chosen safety over action. Tommy dying in that hospital bed while Sam sat helpless in a plastic chair. Sarah packing her bags while he stared into another empty glass. The burning house on the reservation, the screams barely audible over the crackling flames, and his 21-year-old self hitting the gas instead of the brakes. "I failed my own son," he choked out. "I couldn't save him from cancer. How am I supposed to save anyone from whatever this is?" "Tommy's death wasn't your fault," Luna said, her voice impossibly gentle for someone describing murder in a child's bedroom. But walking away from that fire was your choice, and right now you get to choose again. The footsteps had reached the top of the stairs. Sam could hear them pause, probably deciding which room to check first. Tommy's door was closed, but the others stood open. They'd find this room eventually. Sam's mind raced through possibilities, each one more hopeless than the last. He was 58 years old, soft around the middle, with a bum leg and hands that shook before noon without bourbon to steady them. Whatever training he'd once possessed had been buried under decades of deliberate forgetting. Even if he wanted to fight, and Christ, he wasn't sure he did, what chance would he have against what sounded like professional operatives? "What about the others?" he asked desperately, grasping for any excuse to avoid the choice Luna was forcing on him. "You said you needed to find the others. Where are they? How do we—" "They're close." Luna's eyes flicked toward the window. "They've been waiting, just like me. But if these people take me tonight, if you let them finish what they started, then we'll all be trapped forever. The other children, the truth about what happened, all of it dies with me." A door opened down the hall. Sam's study, where he kept his father's hunting rifles locked in a cabinet he hadn't opened in years. Did he even remember the combination? Did the guns still work? When was the last time he'd cleaned them? "I don't even know who they are," he whispered. "What they want. Why they killed you. How am I supposed to fight something I don't understand?" "Understanding comes later," Luna said. "First you have to survive long enough for later to matter." Another door. The guest bathroom this time, the squeak of its hinges instantly recognizable. They were being methodical, professional. Soon they'd reach the master bedroom, and after that— Sam looked at his son's room, really looked at it. The model airplanes Tommy had built with painstaking care. The books they'd read together, their spines cracked from repeated use. The baseball glove that would never again catch a fly ball. This room was a shrine to his failures, to the life he should have lived, to the father he should have been. "He would have been brave," Sam said quietly, touching the P-51 Mustang with one trembling finger. "Tommy, if he were here right now, he would have been brave." "Yes," Luna agreed, "he would have been. The question is, will you?" The master bedroom door opened with a soft click. After that, there was only Tommy's room left to search. Sam closed his eyes and saw his son's face, not pale and hollow from the hospital, but bright with 8-year-old determination, the way he'd looked building that treehouse in secret, the way he'd looked reading adventure stories about knights who never backed down from a fight. "Okay," Sam whispered, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Tell me what to do." Luna's face transformed, the frightened girl vanishing to reveal something ancient and fierce. The window. Tommy's secret way out, the trellis he used to sneak down to build his treehouse. "You remember?" Sam's heart lurched. Of course he remembered. He'd pretended not to notice the muddy footprints, the bent lattice work, his 8-year-old son's elaborate schemes to surprise his father with a hidden fort in the old oak. Tommy had been so proud when he'd finally revealed his secret project, never knowing that Sam had watched him climb down that trellis a dozen times. "It won't hold our weight." "It doesn't have to hold long." Luna was already at the window, her fingers working the old latch with surprising expertise, just long enough. The master bedroom fell silent. They'd finished searching it. Sam's hands moved without conscious thought, muscle memory from another lifetime guiding him to Tommy's closet. Behind the winter coats that still smelled faintly of his son, he found what he was looking for, the emergency kit he'd assembled years ago and forgotten. Flashlight, first aid supplies, and wrapped in an old towel, the service pistol he'd brought back from Vietnam and sworn he'd never touch again. The metal felt alien in his hands, heavier than he remembered. His finger found the safety, checked the chamber. Loaded. Some part of him had always been waiting for this moment, even if his conscious mind had buried the possibility beneath decades of guilt and bourbon. "Sam!" Luna's voice was barely a whisper. She had the window open now, cold air streaming into the room like salvation. "They're at the door!" The doorknob turned slowly, professionally quiet. Sam realized with crystal clarity that there was no going back now. Whatever life he'd been living for the past 20 years, the careful routine of cattle and solitude, the measured doses of alcohol to numb the edges of memory, the safe distance from anything that mattered, was over. He thought of Tommy reading adventure stories under the covers with a flashlight, whispering about brave knights who protected the innocent. He thought of the burning house on the reservation, the screams he'd driven away from, the choice he'd made to look the other way. He thought of Luna's scars, of her words, "They're the reason we couldn't move on." 20 years of cowardice ended in that moment. "Go," he breathed, motioning Luna toward the window. "I'll be right behind you." She swung one leg over the sill, then paused. "The others, when we find them, you'll see things that don't make sense. Dead children walking, memories that feel more real than the present. Don't question it. Don't try to logic your way through it. Just trust what you feel." The door to Tommy's room began to open. Sam raised the pistol, his hands steadier than they'd been in years. "I understand." "No," Luna said, disappearing into the darkness outside. "But you will." Sam followed her through the window as the door burst open behind him. Shouts erupted from the room, sharp, angry voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A flashlight beam swept across the space where he'd been standing seconds before. The trellis groaned under his weight but held. His bad legs screamed as he half climbed, half fell toward the ground, but the pain felt clean somehow. Real, the first real thing he'd felt in years. Luna waited for him in the shadow of the old oak tree, her bare feet somehow silent on the snow-crusted ground. Above them, dark figures moved across Tommy's window, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like angry spirits. "This way," she whispered, leading him away from the house toward the tree line. Sam glanced back once at the home where he'd spent 20 years hiding from the world. Light blazed from every window now, his sanctuary violated by strangers who moved with military precision. Whatever they wanted, whoever they were, they wouldn't give up easily. "Where are we going?" he asked as they reached the edge of the pasture. Luna paused. Her young face turned toward the distant mountains barely visible against the storm-dark sky. "Back to where it started, the reservation, the house where we died." She looked at him, and her eyes held depths that belonged to someone who'd seen the worst the world could offer. "The others are waiting there. They've been waiting for 20 years. Sam felt something shift inside his chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The same feeling he'd had in those final moments before a firefight in Vietnam, when time slowed down and everything became sharp and clear and possible. The feeling of stepping across a line he could never uncross. Behind them, engines roared to life. Headlights swept across the pasture, searching. "Then, let's go find them," he said, and meant it. They disappeared into the storm together, leaving behind the life Sam Hartwell had built from guilt and isolation, walking toward a truth that had been waiting in the darkness for 20 years. Chapter 6, Tests and Allies. The storm swallowed them whole within 50 yards of the house. Sam had lived through Montana winters his entire life, but this felt different, supernatural in its intensity, as if the weather itself was conspiring to hide them. Snow fell in sheets so thick he could barely see Luna's silhouette ahead of him, her bare feet somehow finding sure footing where his boots slipped and stumbled. Behind them, the search engines grew louder, more desperate. Headlights swept back and forth across the pasture like prison spotlights, but the beams couldn't penetrate the unnatural darkness that seemed to cling to them as they moved. "How are you not freezing?" Sam shouted over the wind, watching Luna navigate the treacherous terrain in nothing but her thin dress. She glanced back, snowflakes catching in her dark hair. "The dead don't feel cold the same way. It's one of the rules." Rules. The word struck him like a physical blow. He was operating in a world with different physics now, different possibilities. 20 years of careful rationality crumbled as he watched this impossible girl lead him through a storm that seemed to part around her presence. They reached the tree line, just as the first ATV roared past their position, close enough that Sam could have reached out and touched it. The rider wore military-style gear and night vision goggles, scanning the ground with methodical precision. Professional, well-funded. This wasn't some random intrusion. These people had been planning, preparing, hunting. Government? Sam whispered, as they pressed deeper into the pine forest. Worse. Luna paused beside a massive Douglas fir, its trunk wide enough to hide them both. Private contractors? The kind of people who clean up messes that official agencies can't acknowledge. The revelation hit Sam's gut like ice water. Whatever had happened on the reservation in 1967, whatever had killed 4 children and been covered up for 20 years, it was big enough to warrant ongoing suppression, big enough to kill 4. "What did you see that night?" he asked. "What made them come after you?" Luna's expression darkened. "The man who started the fire, we saw his face, we heard him talking to his partner about making it look accidental, about how nobody would investigate too carefully. 4 Indian kids dead in a house fire, just another tragedy on the reservation." Sam's hands clenched into fists. The casual racism, the calculated dismissal of young lives, it brought back memories of Vietnam, of missions where civilian casualties were written off as acceptable losses. He'd walked away from that world, but it had never stopped existing. The ATV engines were spreading out now, forming a search grid. These weren't random pursuers. They had training, coordination, unlimited resources. How long before they brought in helicopters, thermal imaging, dogs? "We need help," Sam said grimly. "We can't outrun them forever." "We won't have to." Luna pointed deeper into the forest, where the trees grew so thick that moonlight barely penetrated. "Someone's coming." At first, Sam saw nothing but shadows and snow. Then the shadows began to move with purpose, and he realized they weren't alone in the forest. Figures emerged from behind trees and rocky outcroppings, men in heavy winter coats, moving with the silent grace of people who'd spent their lives in these mountains. The first man to reach them was perhaps 40, with weathered features and long black hair streaked with premature grey. He carried a rifle with casual familiarity and studied Sam with eyes that missed nothing. "You're Hartwell," the man said. It wasn't a question. "And you are?" "Joseph Crow Dog. My grandfather was the fire chief who investigated the house fire 20 years ago." Joseph's gaze shifted to Luna, and Sam saw something flicker across his features, recognition mixed with impossible acceptance. "Before he died, he told me the truth about what really happened that night. He said someday the dead children would come back, and when they did, we'd need to be ready to help them." 2 more men materialized from the darkness. Brothers by their similar features, both armed and alert. They positioned themselves with military precision, creating a defensive perimeter that spoke of serious training. "You've been watching for her," Sam said, understanding beginning to dawn. "For all of them," Joseph confirmed. "My grandfather wasn't the only one who knew the fire was murder. Some of us have been keeping watch, waiting, preparing. The spirits told us this day would come." One of the brothers held up a hand for silence. In the distance, they could hear the ATVs growing closer, their engines whining through the storm. Voices shouted coordinates, tactical communications that confirmed Sam's worst fears about their pursuers' capabilities. "How many?" Joseph asked quietly. "At least 6 vehicles at the house," Sam replied. "Could be 20 men, maybe more." Joseph nodded grimly. "Then we'd better move fast. The others are waiting at the old church on the reservation. If we can get Luna there safely, she can call the rest of them home." "The rest of them?" Luna spoke for the first time since the men had appeared. "The other children who died in the fire. My friends. They're still trapped, Sam, still waiting for justice." Her young face hardened with ancient determination. "Tonight we're going to give it to them." #Chapter 7, The Approach. The words hit Sam like a physical blow. Justice. He'd spent 20 years running from that concept, convincing himself it was an abstract ideal that belonged to other people, better people. People who didn't freeze when courage mattered most. "What kind of justice?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would change everything. Luna's eyes reflected depths that had nothing to do with her apparent 16 years, the kind that names the guilty, the kind that makes sure what happened to us never happens again. She paused, snowflakes melting on her scarred arms without seeming to affect her, the kind that requires witnesses willing to speak the truth, no matter the cost. Joseph Crow Dog checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. My grandfather spent 20 years gathering evidence. Names, dates, photographs they thought were destroyed. He knew they'd come for anyone who threatened to expose what really happened. "They killed him," one of the brothers said quietly. "Made it look like a heart attack, but Joseph's grandfather was healthy as a horse. Started asking too many questions about government contracts on reservation land, about why that particular house had to burn." Sam felt the familiar weight of conspiracy pressing down on him, the same suffocating sense of powerlessness he'd experienced in Vietnam when orders came down that made no moral sense. But this time was different. This time he wasn't a young soldier following commands. He was a man with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The ATV engines were getting closer, their mechanical whine cutting through the storm like angry wasps. Joseph motioned for silence, and the group moved deeper into the forest with fluid coordination. Sam marveled at how the reservation men moved through terrain they obviously knew like their own backyard, while he stumbled and crashed through underbrush like the city-soft rancher he'd become. "How far to the church?" Sam whispered during a brief pause. 2 miles through the forest, half-mile by road, but they'll be watching the roads." Joseph's expression was grim. "The church sits on sacred ground. My people have been preparing it for weeks, ever since the dreams started." "Dreams?" "All of us had them," the second brother explained. 4 children calling for help. Smoke and flames and voices screaming for justice. The dreams got stronger every night until we knew they were coming back." Luna stumbled slightly, catching herself against a pine tree. For the first time since Sam had found her, she looked fragile, uncertain. "The closer we get, the harder it becomes. Being near the place where we died, it pulls at us, tries to drag us back into that night." Sam instinctively moved closer to her, his protective instincts overriding rational thought. "What happens if it does? If you get pulled back?" "Then we stay dead, really dead. And the men who killed us stay free." Luna's voice carried a weight of finality that made Sam's chest tighten. "That's why they're so desperate to stop us tonight. This is their last chance to bury the truth forever." A helicopter's distant rotors began chopping through the storm, still far off but growing closer. Joseph cursed in what Sam assumed was Blackfeet, then switched back to English. "They're bringing in air support. We need to move faster." The group picked up pace, but Sam could see the strain beginning to show on Luna. With each step toward the reservation, she seemed to become more translucent, more ethereal. The snow was starting to fall through her rather than on her, and her footprints were growing fainter. "She's fading," Sam said, panic creeping into his voice. "The closer she gets to the place of her death, the more the past tries to reclaim her," Joseph explained without breaking stride. "It's why the other children haven't been able to complete the journey alone. They needed someone living to anchor them to the present." The weight of responsibility settled on Sam's shoulders like a lead blanket. Everything depended on him now. Luna's existence, the truth about the murders, justice for 4 dead children. All the things he'd failed to provide for his own son. "I don't know how to anchor someone to life," he said desperately. "I couldn't even save my own boy from cancer." Luna's hand found his, and though her touch was growing cold, it was still real, still there. "You're doing it now, by choosing to be here, by choosing to fight instead of running away." The helicopter was definitely closer now, its searchlight beginning to sweep through the trees behind them. In the distance, Sam could hear dogs barking, tracking dogs, probably brought in to follow their scent trail. "How much farther?" he asked. 1 mile, Joseph replied. "But it's going to be the hardest mile of your life." As if summoned by his words, Luna gasped and stumbled, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. For a terrifying moment she was barely there at all, just an outline of a girl, a memory trying desperately to maintain form in the physical world. Sam grabbed her other hand, holding on with desperate strength. "Stay with me. Whatever you're seeing, whatever's trying to pull you back, stay with me." Luna's eyes focused on his face, and gradually she solidified again. "The fire," she whispered. "I can smell the smoke, hear their voices, the men who killed us. They're laughing about how easy it was." "Then let's make sure they stop laughing," Sam said, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. The helicopter's searchlight swept across their position, missing them by yards. Dogs bayed somewhere behind them, closer than before. Ahead lay the reservation, the church, and a reckoning 20 years in the making. Sam had spent 2 decades running from the moment that defined his cowardice. Now he was walking straight toward another moment that would define everything else. #Chapter 8. The ordeal begins. The first test came when they reached the creek. Sam stared at the rushing water, black as oil in the moonlight, swollen with snowmelt and spring rain. Under normal circumstances, it would be knee-deep, manageable. But Luna stood at the bank, trembling, her form flickering like a television losing signal. "I can't," she whispered, and Sam heard 20 years of death in her voice. "The water, it remembers drowning. It remembers all the ways people die." Joseph waded in without hesitation, the current tugging at his boots. "Running water disrupts spiritual energy. She'll need to be carried across." The helicopter's searchlight swept closer, its beam cutting through the storm in methodical patterns. Behind them, tracking dogs bayed with increasing excitement. They'd found the scent trail. Sam looked at Luna's terrified face and realized this was it. His moment. Not the house fire 20 years ago where he'd failed, but here, now, when a frightened girl needed someone to believe in her enough to carry her through hell. He scooped Luna into his arms, surprised by how solid she felt, how real. Her scars pressed against his jacket, raised tissue that told stories of unimaginable pain. "Close your eyes. Think about something else. Think about justice." The creek hit his legs like liquid ice, but Sam pushed forward, each step a conscious choice to keep moving when every instinct screamed at him to turn back. Luna's weight shifted in his arms, and for a terrifying moment he felt her becoming lighter, less substantial. "Stay with me," he commanded, his voice cutting through her panic. "You're not drowning. You're not burning. You're here with me, and we're going to make them pay." Luna's arms tightened around his neck, and gradually her form solidified again. By the time they reached the far bank, she was fully present, her dark eyes blazing with renewed determination. Joseph helped pull them from the water. "The dogs won't be able to track us across running water. We've bought ourselves time." But as they crested the ridge overlooking the reservation, Sam saw how little time they actually had. Vehicles surrounded the old church, black SUVs with government plates, men in tactical gear setting up a perimeter. Searchlights turned the sacred ground into a military staging area. "They're already there," one of the brothers said grimly. "Someone told them where we were going." Joseph's face hardened. "Or they've been watching the church for years, waiting for this night." Luna stepped forward, and Sam felt the temperature drop 10 degrees around her. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that didn't belong to any living throat. Other voices, other children, speaking in unison. They cannot stop what has already begun. The dead have been patient, but patience has its limits. The words sent ice through Sam's veins, but also something else. Recognition. This was what he'd sensed that first night in the stable, not just Luna, but all of them. 4 murdered children who'd been waiting 20 years for someone brave enough to help them complete unfinished business. "How do we get past them?" Sam asked. Joseph pointed to a section of fence line where shadows seemed unnaturally thick. "There's an old smuggler's route my grandfather showed me. Gets us behind the church, but we'll have to crawl through a drainage tunnel under the road." "A tunnel," Luna said, and Sam heard the fear creeping back into her voice. Underground, like being buried. This was the real test, Sam realized. Not just Luna's courage, but his own. Every step toward the church was forcing him deeper into a world where the dead walked and justice wore the faces of murdered children, a world where his 20-year retreat into safe isolation meant nothing. The helicopter's rotors grew thunderous overhead, its searchlight raking the ridge where they'd been standing moments before. In the wash of artificial illumination, Sam caught a glimpse of Luna's face, young, terrified, but absolutely determined. "Tell me about your friends," he said as they moved toward the drainage tunnel. "The other children who died with you." Luna's expression softened. Marcus was only 8. He collected baseball cards and wanted to be a pilot. Sarah was my age. She was going to be a teacher. And David, her voice broke slightly, David was going to marry me someday. We promised each other that summer. Sam felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, but finally allowing light into spaces that had been sealed shut for decades. These weren't just victims or symbols or supernatural phenomena. They had been real children with real dreams, murdered for the convenience of men who saw their lives as acceptable losses. "They're going to know those names," he said fiercely. "Everyone's going to know those names." They reached the tunnel entrance, a concrete pipe barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Water rushed through the bottom, and the darkness beyond seemed absolute. Luna stared into that blackness, her entire body shaking. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't go underground. Not again." Sam dropped to his knees beside the tunnel entrance, looking into the void that represented everything Luna feared most. Burial, forgetting, the final silence that had claimed her friends. Above them, helicopter rotors chopped the air like mechanical vultures. "Then we'll go together," he said, and meant it completely. Chapter 9. The Dark Moment. Sam crawled into the tunnel first, the concrete walls pressing against his shoulders like a coffin built for the living. Ice-cold water soaked through his pants, and the darkness ahead swallowed his outstretched hand completely. Behind him, Luna's breathing came in short, panicked gasps. "I can't do this, Sam. The walls, they're closing in. Just like that night. Stay with me," Sam whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "We're almost through." But even as he said it, he felt Luna's presence beginning to fragment. Her hand in his grew cold, then translucent, then barely there at all. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, and Sam realized with growing horror that they were lost in more than just physical darkness. Above them, boots thundered across the road. Voices shouted coordinates. Someone was mapping their route with military precision. "They know where we are," Joseph's voice called from behind, tight with fear. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they circle back." Sam crawled faster, but Luna was fading with each foot of concrete pipe. Her terrified whispers became echoes, then silence. When he reached back to grab her hand, his fingers closed on empty air. "Luna!" No response. Sam twisted around in the cramped space, panic clawing at his throat. In the faint moonlight filtering through the tunnel entrance, he could see Joseph and his men, but Luna was gone. Simply gone. "She's been pulled back," Joseph said grimly. The trauma was too much. Underground spaces, enclosed darkness. It's dragging her into the memory of how she died. Sam's chest constricted. After everything, the flight through the forest, the creek crossing, the desperate race to reach the church, he'd lost her to the very darkness they'd been trying to escape. "How do we get her back?" "We don't," Joseph replied, his words like a death sentence. "Not from here. She's trapped in the moment of her murder now. The only way to free her is to complete the ritual at the church, but without her present to anchor the other spirits." The implication hung in the tunnel air like poison. Without Luna, the other children couldn't manifest. Without the children's testimony, there could be no justice. Without justice, the men who'd murdered them would disappear these witnesses, just like they'd disappeared 4 children 20 years ago. Sam pressed his forehead against the concrete, feeling 20 years of failure crash down on him at once. His son's death, his marriage's collapse, his retreat from every meaningful connection, and now this, Another child lost to his inadequacy, another chance for redemption slipping through his fingers. "We have to keep moving," one of Joseph's brothers urged. "They're bringing in more vehicles. If they trap us in this tunnel—" But Sam wasn't listening. Something was moving in the darkness ahead, not Luna, but something else. Other presences, barely perceptible, like whispers made visible. 3 small figures materializing in the tunnel's depths, their forms more shadow than substance. Marcus, Sarah, David, the other murdered children drawn by Luna's disappearance. The 8-year-old boy clutched a handful of baseball cards that flickered between real and memory. The teenage girl wore a teacher's simple dress, her eyes full of unfinished lessons. The boy who'd promised to marry Luna someday reached toward the space where she'd vanished, his young face twisted with loss that transcended death. "Where is she?" David's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "We felt her calling us home." "She's trapped," Sam said, the words tearing at his throat. The darkness took her back to that night. "Then we'll find her." Sarah's teacher voice carried authority that made the tunnel walls seem less oppressive. "We've found each other before." But as the 3 spirits moved deeper into the tunnel, searching for their lost friend, Sam heard new sounds from above: drilling, power tools, the systematic destruction of their escape route. "They're sealing the tunnel," Joseph said with quiet desperation. "Trapping us underground, just like they trapped the children in that burning house." The helicopter's rotors grew thunderous overhead, and through gaps in the concrete, Sam glimpsed men in tactical gear setting shaped charges along the road surface. These weren't just killers. They were professionals with unlimited resources, and they'd turned the children's sacred ground into a killing field. Water began rushing into the tunnel faster, and Sam realized they'd been herded into this trap deliberately. Every choice they'd made, every route they'd taken, had been anticipated and manipulated. The tunnel wasn't their escape, it was their tomb. As the concrete walls began to shift and crack under the weight of the charges above, Sam understood that he'd failed completely. Luna was lost in traumatic memory. The other children were fading back into death, and he was about to join them in the darkness he'd spent 20 years trying to avoid. The last thing he saw before the tunnel collapsed was David's ghost boy face, still reaching desperately toward the space where Luna had vanished, still calling her name into the crushing black. Chapter 10, The Revelation. Sam expected to die in crushing darkness, but instead found himself standing in brilliant orange light that flickered and danced across wooden walls. The tunnel was gone, the concrete, the rushing water, the weight of collapsing stone, all it had vanished, replaced by the interior of a burning house. He wasn't alone. Luna stood beside him, but she was different now. Younger, maybe 12 years old, her dark hair in braids instead of hanging loose around her shoulders. Her burn scars were gone, replaced by smooth brown skin and clothes that hadn't yet caught fire. Around them, 3 other children huddled together, Marcus clutching his baseball cards, Sarah holding a school book, David reaching for Luna's hand. "You're seeing it now," Luna said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd lived through death itself. The night that started everything. Sam turned slowly, taking in the scene with horrified fascination. The house was modest, a reservation home with handmade furniture and family photographs covering every surface. But smoke was already seeping through the floorboards, and somewhere below, men's voices echoed with casual brutality. "Check the basement again. Make sure the evidence burns completely. What about the kids upstairs?" "What kids?" House was empty when the electrical fire started. Sam felt sick understanding wash over him. They weren't just killed in a fire, they were witnesses to something else. "My father worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs," Luna explained, her child voice eerily calm. "He found documents, proof that government officials were selling reservation land to mining companies. Millions of dollars in illegal deals." Marcus pressed closer to Luna, his 8-year-old face streaked with tears. "The bad men came for the papers. Papa tried to hide us upstairs, but they found us anyway. They couldn't let us live," Sarah added, her teacher's dress beginning to smoke at the edges. "We'd seen their faces, heard their names. Sam watched in mounting horror as flames began licking up through the floorboards. The children's terror was palpable, but underneath it ran something else, a fierce determination that death itself couldn't extinguish. 20 years, David said, his young voice heavy with impossible patience. 20 years of being trapped in this moment, reliving our murder every night, waiting for someone to help us tell the truth. The smoke grew thicker, and Sam could hear the killers moving around below, methodically destroying evidence while 4 children burned alive above their heads. But something else was happening in this supernatural reenactment. Sam could see himself in one of the windows, his 26-year-old face pressed against the glass. "I was there," he whispered, memory and revelation crashing together. "I was driving past on leave from Fort Bragg. I saw the smoke and stopped." "You saw us," Luna said simply. "We were screaming for help, trapped upstairs while they held the doors shut from below." Sam watched his younger self standing paralyzed outside the burning house, seeing the children's faces in the upstairs windows but frozen by indecision. He remembered now, the official report had called it an electrical fire, a tragic accident. The bodies had been too badly burned for proper identification. The case had been closed within hours. "I should have broken down the door," he said, his voice cracking. "I should have fought them. I should have saved you." "You tried." Luna's ghost voice was gentle. "You went to the police. You told them what you'd really seen, men pouring gasoline around the house's foundation, children screaming from locked windows. But nobody listened to a traumatized soldier." The scene shifted, and Sam found himself standing in a police station from 1967, watching his younger self try desperately to convince skeptical officers that the reservation fire had been murder. He remembered the dismissive looks, the implied threats, the suggestion that perhaps his combat stress was making him see things that weren't there. "You became a threat," Sarah explained, "so they discredited you, made sure everyone thought you were unstable. The nightmares, the PTSD symptoms that got worse instead of better," David added. "They weren't just from Vietnam. They were from us, from carrying the truth about our murders for 20 years. Sam understood now why Luna had known so much about his ranch, his failed marriage, his dead son. She hadn't been reading his mind. She'd been living in it, a constant presence in his subconscious, waiting for him to become strong enough to face the truth they both carried. "The men who killed you," he said, "they're the same ones hunting us now." "Some of them," Luna nodded. "Others are their sons, their protégés. The conspiracy grew, became an institution. Our deaths weren't just murders, they were the foundation stone of something much larger." The burning house began to fade, reality reasserting itself, but Sam could feel the weight of true knowledge settling into his bones. Everything made sense now. His isolation, his guilt, his desperate need to save Luna. He wasn't just helping 4 murdered children find justice. He was finally, after 20 years of cowardice, choosing to be the man who broke down the door. #Chapter 11, gathering strength. The burning house dissolved around them like smoke, but Sam felt its heat still radiating from his chest. Not the fire's destruction, but something else. Purpose, maybe. Or just the simple, terrible clarity of finally knowing the truth after 20 years of half-remembered nightmares. He found himself back in the collapsed tunnel, but it wasn't collapsed anymore. The concrete walls stood intact, water trickling peacefully through the bottom, moonlight filtering through both ends like silver hope. Joseph and his brothers crouched nearby, their faces painted with cautious relief. "You were gone," Joseph said quietly, "both of you. For almost 10 minutes you just weren't here anymore." Luna stood beside Sam, but she was herself again, 16, scarred, fully present in the waking world. Her dark eyes held new steel, as if witnessing her own murder had somehow freed her from its power over her. "They showed him everything," she said, "the whole truth. Now he knows what we're really fighting." Sam flexed his hands, surprised by how steady they felt. The panic that had been his constant companion for decades was gone, replaced by something he almost forgotten, the calm focus he'd felt in combat when the mission became crystal clear. These weren't just ghosts seeking justice. They were witnesses to a conspiracy that had grown like cancer through 20 years of silence. "The papers your father found," he said to Luna. "The land deals. Do they still exist?" "Hidden," she replied. "David's father was a tribal policeman. He made copies before they killed our families, buried them in a place only the dead remember." David materialized beside her, his young face grave with purpose. "The old ceremonial cave behind the church. My father wrapped them in oilcloth and hid them behind the sacred stones. He thought he was protecting evidence for a trial that would never come." "Trials require living witnesses," Sarah added, appearing with Marcus clutching her hand. "And they made sure we couldn't testify." Sam felt something fundamental shifting in his chest. For 20 years he'd seen these children as his failure, his shame made manifest. But they weren't symbols of his inadequacy. They were his allies. 4 murdered kids who'd spent 2 decades gathering strength in the spaces between life and death, waiting for him to become the man they needed. "The men above us," he said. "How many?" Joseph consulted a small radio. "My cousin's been watching from the ridge. 8 vehicles, maybe 30 men. Military contractors, not government agents. Someone's paying serious money to keep this buried." "They can't kill what's already dead," Marcus said with 8-year-old logic that cut straight to the heart of things. "And they can't discredit ghosts in court." Luna stepped closer to Sam, and he felt her supernatural cold mixing with something warmer. Trust, maybe, or just the simple relief of no longer carrying their shared burden alone. "The ritual at the church," he said. "It's not just about summoning us, it's about making us visible to the living world, giving us voices that cameras can record, words that microphones can capture." "Testimony," Sam said, understanding flooding through him. "Unshakable testimony from witnesses they can't intimidate or disappear." "But we need to reach the cave first," David added. "Without those documents, our words are just stories. With them," he smiled, and Sam glimpsed the man he would have become. "With them we can bring down everyone who profited from our murders." The sound of drilling had stopped above them. Through the concrete, Sam could hear boots moving in coordinated patterns, a professional search, methodical and patient. But something had changed in the tactical rhythm. Confusion, maybe, radio chatter that sounded increasingly frustrated. "They lost us," Joseph realized. "When you and Luna went wherever you went, it broke their tracking somehow." "Because we're not just running anymore," Sam said, feeling truth settle into his bones like ballast. "We're hunting." He turned to Joseph, his mind already working through logistics with military precision. "The ceremonial cave. How do we reach it without crossing their perimeter?" "There's a network of natural passages in the limestone," Joseph replied. "Sacred spaces my people have used for centuries. But it means going deeper underground, through spaces that haven't seen light since the world was young." Luna nodded without hesitation. "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore, not when I know what's waiting on the other side." Sam looked at the 4 children, Marcus with his baseball cards, Sarah with her teacher's dignity, David with his fierce protectiveness, Luna with her hard-won courage. 20 years ago he'd failed to save them, but maybe salvation had never been the point. Maybe they'd been saving themselves all along, gathering strength in the spaces between heartbeats, waiting for him to become worthy of their trust. Above them, the professionals with their night vision and tactical gear continued their methodical search, never suspecting that their quarry had become their hunters. The dead had been patient long enough. Chapter 12, The Road Back. The limestone passages Joseph led them through belonged to a world older than human memory. Sam's flashlight beam caught ancient handprints on the walls, red ochre pressed into stone by fingers that had traced these tunnels when the world was young. The air tasted of minerals and time, and their footsteps echoed in chambers that had never known electric light. "How much farther?" Sam asked, though his voice carried none of the desperation that would have consumed him days ago. The panic attacks, the shaking hands, the crushing weight of 20 years' worth of survivors' guilt, all of it had burned away in the vision of that house fire. What remained was something harder, more focused, a soldier with a mission. 1/4 mile, Joseph replied, his voice barely above a whisper. But the last stretch is the hardest. We have to climb through a chimney that opens directly behind the church altar. Luna moved beside Sam like a whisper made flesh, her presence more solid than it had ever been. The other children flickered in and out of visibility, Marcus counting his baseball cards by memory, Sarah rehearsing testimony in her teacher's voice, David practicing the words he'd use to identify their killers. They were preparing for trial, Sam realized, a trial 20 years in the making. "They're still up there," Luna said, tilting her head toward sounds only she could hear, tearing apart the forest, looking for bodies that will never be found. Sam paused, pressing his hand against the tunnel wall. Through 50 feet of limestone, he could feel the vibrations of heavy machinery. They were bringing in excavators, earth movers, equipment meant to reshape the landscape itself. They're not just hunting us anymore, they're destroying the evidence. "The cave entrance," Joseph said grimly. "They're going to bury it." The magnitude of the conspiracy was finally becoming clear to Sam. This wasn't just about silencing witnesses to a decades-old murder. The land deals Luna's father had discovered had grown into something vast, a network of corruption that stretched from reservation boundaries to Washington boardrooms. 4 dead children weren't just ghosts seeking justice. They were the loose thread that could unravel billions of dollars in illegal development. "How long do we have?" he asked. David's spirit voice carried across the tunnel like wind through dry leaves. "They're moving fast, maybe an hour before they seal everything." Sam felt his old infantry training kick in, the ability to assess tactical situations under pressure, to find solutions when retreat wasn't an option. They were outnumbered 30-1, outgunned and running out of time. But they had advantages the enemy couldn't calculate. Allies who couldn't be killed, witnesses who couldn't be silenced, and evidence hidden in a place only the dead could find. "The documents," he said to David. "Your father wrapped them in oilcloth? Behind the sacred stones. He made me promise to remember even if—" The boy's voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Even if they killed him, even if they killed everyone. The tunnel began to angle upward, and Sam could smell something different in the air. Not just limestone and mineral water, but the faint scent of burning sage. They were approaching sacred ground, the space where the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for the dead to speak. "There's something you need to understand," Luna said as they climbed. "When we manifest fully, when we become solid enough to testify, it costs us. Each word we speak in your world pulls us further from whatever peace we've found." Sam stopped climbing. "You mean you could disappear forever?" "We mean we're choosing to," Sarah said, her teacher's voice patient and sure. 20 years of waiting, Sam. 20 years of watching our killers grow rich and powerful while our families grieved. We're ready to spend everything we have left to stop them. The finality in her voice hit Sam like a physical blow. These children weren't just seeking justice. They were preparing to sacrifice their very existence for it. The last vestiges of their interrupted lives, the final echoes of who they'd been, all of it consumed in one moment of testimony that could topple an empire built on their bones. "No," he said fiercely. "There has to be another way." "This is the way," Marcus said, his 8-year-old wisdom cutting straight through Sam's denial. "We've been dead for 20 years, but we can make our deaths mean something." Above them, the tunnel opened into a natural chimney that stretched toward starlight. Sam could see the church's foundation stones, hear the distant sound of helicopters circling like mechanical vultures. They were almost there, almost to the moment when everything would change. But as he prepared to make the final climb, Sam realized the true weight of what he was carrying. Not just the guilt of a failed rescue, but the responsibility of being the last living witness to a truth that powerful men would kill to protect. The children had spent 20 years preparing for this moment. Now it was his turn to be worthy of their sacrifice. #Chapter 13, the final test. Sam's hands found purchase on the limestone walls of the natural chimney, each grip carrying him closer to a confrontation 20 years in the making. Above him, moonlight filtered through the gap where ancient stone met modern church foundation, and he could hear the mechanical thunder of excavators moving into position around the sacred ground. "They're sealing the perimeter," Joseph whispered from below, his voice tight with urgency. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." Sam pulled himself up the final few feet and pressed his eye to a crack in the foundation stones. The church sat dark and empty, but floodlights blazed beyond its walls, where a small army of contractors worked with military precision. They'd surrounded the entire sacred site, not just hunting anymore, but preparing to erase it from existence entirely. Luna materialized beside him, her presence more solid than he'd ever felt it, as if proximity to her own grave was feeding her strength. "The cave entrance is behind the altar," she said, "but we're not the only ones who know about it." Through the crack, Sam saw movement inside the church. 3 men in expensive suits examining architectural plans by flashlight. Not contractors or security personnel, but the architects of the conspiracy itself. After 20 years of hiding behind intermediaries and hired killers, they'd come to personally oversee the destruction of the evidence that could destroy them. "Senator Morrison," Luna said, her voice carrying ancient hatred. "He was young then, just a Bureau of Indian Affairs administrator. But he's the one who ordered our deaths." Sam recognized the silver-haired man from newspaper photos, a respected politician known for his work on environmental protection, his advocacy for tribal rights. The irony was bitter as acid. And the others? Morrison's son-in-law, now a federal judge, and the CEO of Blackstone Mining, the company that's been strip mining sacred land for 2 decades. David's spirit voice was eerily calm. 3 men who built careers on our bones. The children began to manifest more fully around Sam, their forms gaining substance as they drew power from the sacred ground above their unmarked graves. Marcus clutched his baseball cards with hands that cast actual shadows. Sarah's teacher dress rustled with real fabric. David stood protective and solid beside his sister's ghost. But Sam could see the cost in their eyes, a dimming, as if each moment of physical presence burned away some essential part of them. They were spending their very existence to be here, trading whatever peace they'd found for one last chance at justice. "The documents first," Sam said, his military training cutting through emotion. "We get the evidence, then we worry about confronting them." Joseph had reached the chimney opening, his face grim with determination. "There's a service tunnel that connects to the cave system. My grandfather showed it to me when I was 12, but it means going directly under the church while they're inside." Above them, one of the excavators roared to life, its engine drowning out the night sounds of the forest. Sam felt the vibration through the limestone. They were beginning to reshape the landscape, burying not just the cave but the entire sacred site under tons of earth and concrete. "They're not just destroying evidence," he realized with growing horror. "They're building something, right here, right on top of the graves." Luna nodded, her scarred hands clenching into fists. "A resort, luxury cabins where wealthy men can hunt on stolen land. They're turning our burial ground into their playground." The obscenity of it hit Sam like a physical blow. 4 murdered children, their families destroyed, their sacred places desecrated. All so rich men could profit twice from the same crime. First, the illegal mining rights, now the development deals built on the bones of their victims. 20 years, Sam said, understanding finally flooding through him. "You've been waiting 20 years for someone strong enough to help you stop this." "Not just anyone," Sarah said gently. "You, Sam. The witness who saw our murder, the soldier who tried to save us, the man who carried our truth even when it nearly destroyed him." Sam looked at each of them, these children who had become his salvation as much as he'd tried to become theirs. Marcus with his innocent courage, Sarah with her teacher's wisdom, David with his fierce protectiveness. Luna with her hard-won strength. They weren't just seeking justice anymore. They were offering him redemption. "What do you need me to do?" Luna smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the 16-year-old girl she should have been allowed to become. "Help us testify. Be our voice in the world of the living. And when it's over," she paused, her form already beginning to flicker, "remember us as we were, not as what they made us." Above them, the church bell began to toll, not rung by human hands, but resonating with supernatural purpose. Midnight was coming, and with it the moment when the boundary between worlds would be thin enough for the dead to speak their truth. Sam gripped the limestone walls tighter, feeling the weight of 20 years' worth of guilt transforming into something harder, more useful: purpose. These children had chosen him not because he was perfect, but because he understood the cost of failure. Tonight, he would not fail again. Chapter 14, The Confrontation. The church bell's supernatural tolling crescendoed as Sam pulled himself through the foundation gap, his boots touching consecrated ground for the first time in 20 years. The men inside froze at the sound. Senator Morrison dropping his architectural plans, his son-in-law reaching instinctively for a sidearm that wasn't there, the mining CEO backing toward the altar with the practiced caution of a man who'd ordered violence from a comfortable distance. "Impossible," Morrison whispered, his silver hair gleaming in the flashlight beams. "The perimeter is secure. No one could have—" His words died as Luna materialized in the center aisle, her burn scars glowing with otherworldly fire. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an instant, and their breath began to fog in the suddenly Arctic air. Behind her, the other children took shape, Marcus with his baseball cards, Sarah in her teaching dress, David standing protective and fierce. "Hello, Senator," Luna said, her voice carrying the weight of 2 decades' worth of rage. "Remember me?" Morrison's face went corpse-white as recognition dawned. "You're dead. I watched you burn. All of you." "You watched us murdered," David corrected, his child's voice cutting like a blade. "By men you paid, in a fire you ordered." The mining CEO, a bloated man whose expensive suit couldn't disguise the corruption that had fed his wealth, stumbled backward against the altar. "This isn't real. Hallucinations, some kind of gas leak." "The only thing that isn't real," Sarah said with a teacher's patient authority, "is your version of history. 20 years of lies built on our bones." Sam emerged from the shadows behind them, his rifle trained on the 3 men who'd orchestrated the murders. 20 years of survivors' guilt had burned away in the presence of the children's truth, leaving something harder and infinitely more dangerous. A soldier with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. "The cave," he said to Joseph, who'd followed him up through the foundation. "Get the documents. These bastards aren't going anywhere." Morrison tried to regain his composure, falling back on decades of political instinct. "Mr. Hartwell, you're clearly suffering from severe psychological trauma. These hallucinations, they're symptoms of your PTSD, nothing more. We can get you help." "I can see them too," Joseph said flatly, moving toward the altar. "And I'm betting your security cameras are recording every word they speak." The federal judge, Morrison's son-in-law, laughed nervously. "Courts don't accept testimony from ghosts. This is all meaningless." His words choked off as Marcus stepped forward, solid as any living child, and placed his small hand on the man's expensive briefcase. The leather cracked and blackened at his touch, and papers inside began to smolder. "We're not just ghosts anymore," Marcus said with 8-year-old certainty. "We're witnesses. And tonight, the living world can see us too." Above them, the excavators had stopped their work. Sam could hear shouting voices, mechanical failures, equipment breaking down in ways that defied explanation. The children's manifestation was affecting more than just the church. Reality itself was bending around their presence, making space for truth that had been buried too long. Luna advanced on Morrison, each step leaving scorch marks in the wooden floor. "Tell me, Senator, how much money have you made from our sacred land? How many zeros in the bank accounts you built with our blood?" Morrison backed against the church wall, his political composure finally cracking. The development was legal, every permit, every environmental study forged, David interrupted, based on surveys that erased our burial grounds from the maps. We've had 20 years to watch, to listen, to gather evidence while you thought you were safe. Joseph had reached the hidden entrance behind the altar, his hands working quickly to move the sacred stones his grandfather had shown him decades ago. Sam could see the desperation in the three men's faces as they realized the scope of what was being unveiled, not just their involvement in 4 murders, but a conspiracy that had grown into billions of dollars in illegal development. "The oilcloth package," Luna said to Joseph, though her eyes never left Morrison's face. "My father's handwriting, David's father's police reports, every document they thought they'd destroyed." "Along with photographs," Sarah added, her teacher's voice precise and damning. "Pictures of the payoffs, the forged permits, the meetings where they planned our deaths." The mining CEO made a desperate lunge for the church door, but Marcus appeared in front of him like a living wall of supernatural fire. "You're not leaving," the 8-year-old said with absolute authority. "Not until everyone knows what you did to us." Sam felt something profound shifting in the air around them, the weight of 20 years' worth of hidden truth finally breaking free, demanding acknowledgement from a world that had chosen comfortable lies over difficult justice. The children weren't just seeking revenge, they were rewriting history itself, forcing reality to accommodate their voices. Outside, the mechanical sounds of the cover-up operation were giving way to something else. Sirens, helicopters, the organized chaos of a story too big to contain. The dead had finally found their voices, and the living world was listening. Chapter 15, The Sacrifice. The sirens grew closer as Joseph's hands found the oilcloth package behind the sacred stones. 20 years of hidden truth heavy in his grip. But as he pulled the documents free, Sam saw something that made his blood freeze. The children were beginning to fade. Not disappearing like they had before, but dissolving, their very essence burning away like candle wax in a furnace. Luna's burn scars flickered between solid flesh and translucent memory. Marcus clutched his baseball cards with fingers that were becoming increasingly transparent. Sarah's teaching dress rippled like water, disturbed by an unseen wind. "What's happening to them?" Sam demanded, raising his rifle higher as Morrison tried to edge toward a side door. "The cost," David said, his voice already growing distant. "Speaking in your world, becoming solid enough to testify, it's consuming us. Each word, each moment of manifestation burns away what little we have left." Luna turned to Sam, her scarred face serene despite the supernatural fire consuming her from within. "We told you there would be a price. We're spending our existence to make this testimony real, to give these documents weight that even your courts can't dismiss." Outside, the first FBI helicopter touched down in the church parking lot, drawn by reports of supernatural phenomena that had somehow reached the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Sam could hear agents shouting orders, their voices mixing with the mechanical death rattles of excavators that had inexplicably failed when they tried to bury the sacred ground. 20 years, Senator Morrison gasped, his political composure completely shattered as he watched the children's spirits burn themselves out for justice. 20 years, and you couldn't just stay dead. "We were never dead," Sarah said, her teacher's voice growing fainter with each word. "We were waiting, gathering strength, preparing for this moment when the living world would finally listen." The mining CEO fell to his knees as Marcus stepped closer, the 8-year-old's presence radiating heat like a forge. "Please," the man whimpered, "whatever you want, money, land rights returned to the tribe, we can make a deal." "You can't negotiate with the dead," Marcus said simply. "You can only answer for what you did to them." Sam felt something breaking inside his chest as he watched the children sacrifice themselves piece by piece. These spirits who had become his salvation, his purpose, his family, they were choosing to cease existing rather than let their killers escape justice. The magnitude of their sacrifice made his own decades of guilt seem small and selfish. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "Some other method that doesn't cost you everything." Luna smiled. and for a heartbeat she was solid again. The 16-year-old girl who should have lived to graduate, to fall in love, to have children of her own. This is our choice, Sam. Our revenge and our peace all in one moment. But we need you to carry the story forward, to make sure the living world remembers not just how we died, but how we lived. The church doors burst open as federal agents flooded in, their weapons drawn but useless against conspirators who were already broken by supernatural justice. Agent Rodriguez, the FBI investigator Sam had spoken to weeks earlier, stopped short as she took in the scene. 3 powerful men cowering before translucent children, scorch marks spelling out accusations in multiple languages across the church walls. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. The reports were true. Joseph stepped forward with the oilcloth package, his grandfather's training allowing him to move between worlds with practiced ease. "Federal crimes," he said, placing the documents in Agent Rodriguez's hands. "Murder, fraud, conspiracy, violation of sacred burial grounds, 20 years' worth of evidence." Sam watched the children growing fainter, their forms becoming increasingly ethereal as they spent the last of their spiritual energy to ensure the testimony would hold up in court. David managed one final act of protection, his spirit touch searing a handprint into Morrison's forehead, a brand that would mark the senator as a child killer for whatever remained of his natural life. "Remember us," Sarah whispered, her voice now barely audible above the chaos of federal agents and failing equipment, not as victims, but as children who chose justice over peace. Luna was the last to fade, her scarred hands reaching out to touch Sam's weathered face one final time. "Thank you," she said, her words carrying the weight of absolute forgiveness, "for seeing us, for believing, for becoming the witness we needed you to be." And then they were gone, not departing like spirits returning to another realm, but simply ceasing to exist entirely. 20 years of gathered strength, of patient waiting, of careful planning, all consumed in one moment of perfect justice. Sam stood alone among the federal agents and broken conspirators, holding the memory of 4 children who had chosen to sacrifice their very souls to stop evil from prospering. The living world finally had its truth, but the cost of that victory would haunt him forever. Chapter 16, The Resolution. The silence that followed the children's sacrifice was more profound than death itself. Sam stood in the center of the church, his rifle hanging loose in hands that suddenly felt ancient, surrounded by federal agents whose sophisticated equipment had recorded testimony that would reshape everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between life and death. Agent Rodriguez moved first, her training overriding the metaphysical shock of what she'd witnessed. She knelt beside Senator Morrison, who remained pressed against the church wall. David's handprint burned into his forehead like a brand of Cain. The senator's silver hair had gone completely white in the span of minutes, and his eyes held the hollow stare of a man whose carefully constructed reality had been incinerated by supernatural justice. "Senator Morrison," Rodriguez said, her voice professionally steady despite the tremor in her hands, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and violation of federal laws protecting Native American burial grounds." Morrison didn't respond. He stared at the empty air where Luna had stood moments before, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or confession. The mining CEO had collapsed entirely, curled into a fetal position beside the altar, weeping with the broken sobs of a man who'd finally been forced to see the human cost of his greed. Only the federal judge retained any composure, though his expensive suit was soaked with sweat and his hands shook as Agent Rodriguez's team placed him in restraints. Joseph still held the oilcloth package, though several documents had already been spread across the altar for the federal team to examine. Sam could see photographs that made his stomach turn, images of the original crime scene that had never made it into official reports, pictures of the payoffs and secret meetings, documentation of a conspiracy that had grown like cancer over 20 years. "Mr. Hartwell," Agent Rodriguez said, approaching Sam with careful respect, "I know this has been unprecedented, But we're going to need your full testimony about everything you've witnessed." Sam looked around the church one final time, searching for any trace of the children who had consumed themselves to reach this moment. The scorch marks on the walls were already beginning to fade, and the supernatural cold was giving way to Montana's natural winter chill. Only the handprint on Morrison's forehead remained as physical proof of what had transpired. "They're really gone," he said. "Not quite a question." "They achieved what they came back for," Joseph answered, carefully rewrapping the remaining documents. "In our tradition, spirits who complete their purpose find peace. They won't be wandering anymore, won't be trapped between worlds. They've earned their rest." The words should have been comforting, but Sam felt an emptiness that went beyond grief. For weeks, the children had been his purpose, his salvation from decades of survivor's guilt. Now that purpose had been fulfilled, and they were gone, leaving him alone with the weight of their sacrifice and the echoing memory of Luna's forgiveness. "The evidence will hold up," Rodriguez assured him, though she kept glancing at her equipment readings with obvious confusion. "Our cameras, audio recordings, witness testimony from multiple federal agents. No court in the country will be able to dismiss this as hallucination or hoax." Outside the church, Sam could hear the sounds of the cover-up operation grinding to a halt. The excavators sat silent and broken, their engines seized by supernatural forces that had dissipated with the children's sacrifice. The crew that had come to bury evidence was now being questioned by federal investigators, their own testimonies adding to the mountain of proof that would bring down 3 of the most powerful men in the state. "What happens now?" Sam asked. "Justice," Rodriguez said simply. "Real justice, the kind that's been denied for 20 years. Federal trials, prison sentences, congressional hearings into corruption in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The sacred land will be returned to the tribe, and there will be a proper memorial for the children." Sam nodded, understanding that this was what the children had died for. Not revenge, but restoration. Their names would be spoken with honor instead of whispered in shame. Their families would finally have graves to visit. Their sacred ground would be protected instead of desecrated. But as the federal agents began processing the crime scene and the broken conspirators, Sam felt the familiar weight of isolation settling over his shoulders. The children's sacrifice had given him purpose, had transformed his guilt into something useful. Now that the mission was complete, he was just a damaged veteran again, alone in a world that had no place for men who'd seen too much and survived too long. Joseph seemed to sense his thoughts. "This isn't the end," the younger man said quietly. "The children chose you as their witness, their voice in the living world. That responsibility doesn't end just because their spirits have found peace." Sam looked at the oilcloth package, at the photographs and documents that would reshape history, at the scorch marks that were already becoming legend. Luna's words echoed in his memory, "Remember us not as victims, but as children who chose justice over peace." Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps bearing witness, carrying their truth forward, was a purpose that could sustain him through whatever years remained. The children had given him their forgiveness and their trust. The least he could do was honor both. The living world finally had its truth, and Sam Hartwell had found his redemption in helping the dead speak it. Chapter 17, The Return. 3 months after the trials began, Sam Hartwell drove his pickup truck through Glacier Valley for the first time since that night in the church. The familiar weight of isolation no longer pressed against his shoulders like a lead blanket. Instead, he carried something different, a sense of purpose that had survived the children's sacrifice and grown stronger in the weeks of testimony that followed. The landscape looked different now, though the mountains remained unchanged. Where Morrison's mining operation had scarred the sacred ground, federal restoration crews worked alongside Blackfeet tribal members to heal the earth. Heavy machinery moved with reverence instead of greed, carefully removing contaminated soil and preparing the land for the memorial that would honor 4 children who had chosen justice over peace. Sam parked beside Joseph's truck at what had once been the hidden church. The building itself was gone now, demolished after federal investigators had extracted every piece of evidence from its walls, but the sacred spring bubbled freely again, no longer choked by industrial runoff. Prayer flags in traditional colors fluttered from newly planted cottonwood saplings, and the scent of sage smoke drifted on the winter wind. "You came," Joseph said, emerging from a traditional sweat lodge that hadn't been there during Sam's previous visit. The younger man looked different too, less haunted, more grounded. His grandfather's teachings had proven their worth in ways neither of them had anticipated. "Figured it was time," Sam replied. He'd spent the trial months in Helena, testifying before federal courts and congressional committees, his every word scrutinized by lawyers who struggled to reconcile supernatural evidence with legal precedent. The media had dubbed him the Ghost Whisperer of Montana, a title that made him wince but seemed to carry weight with juries who watched surveillance footage of children who shouldn't exist speaking truths that couldn't be denied. "The families wanted to meet you," Joseph said. "The children's families. They're here today for the blessing ceremony." Sam's throat tightened. He'd avoided this moment throughout the trials, focusing on the legal mechanics of justice rather than the human cost of the children's sacrifice. But Luna's final words echoed in his memory, "Remember us not as victims, but as children who chose justice over peace." An elderly woman approached them, her weathered hands carrying a star quilt worked in patterns that seemed to shimmer with their own light. Sam recognized her immediately from the court proceedings, Sarah's grandmother, who had testified about an 8-year-old girl with dreams of becoming a teacher. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying decades of grief transformed into something approaching peace. "I'm Mary Crowfeather, Sarah's grandmother." Sam removed his hat, suddenly aware of how inadequate words would be. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry it took 20 years for the truth to come out." Mary studied his face with eyes that seemed to see through him entirely. "The children chose well," she said finally. "They needed someone who understood carrying the dead, someone who knew what it meant to survive when others didn't. You gave them the voice they needed in your world." Other family members emerged from the ceremony area, Marcus's father, now a grandfather himself, David's cousins, who had grown up knowing their family had been murdered, but not by whom, Luna's younger brother, who carried the same burn scars from the house fire that had claimed his sister but left him alive and guilty for 43 years. "She talked about you," Luna's brother said quietly, "in the hospital, before she died. She said she'd seen a soldier who couldn't save them and that she wasn't angry. She said he looked more hurt than we were." The words hit Sam like physical blows. All these years, he'd carried the weight of failing to prevent the children's deaths, never knowing that Luna had seen his attempts, had forgiven him even as she died. "The children prepared for this moment for 20 years, Mary continued, "gathering strength, learning to manifest in your world, waiting for the right witness. They knew the cost of their sacrifice, but they also knew the cost of letting evil prosper. They chose to spend their existence for justice, and through you, they achieved it." Sam looked across the sacred ground where the memorial would stand. 4 bronze figures of children playing together for eternity, their names carved in stone that would endure long after everyone who remembered the trials was dead. Morrison, his son-in-law, and the mining CEO would spend their remaining years in federal prison, their fortunes seized to fund restoration efforts and victim compensation. But more than that, the children's sacrifice had changed something fundamental about how the world treated similar cases. Federal legislation now required supernatural investigators for any crimes involving native burial grounds. The boundaries between life and death, between justice and vengeance, had been redrawn by 4 children who refused to let murder become profitable. "They gave me purpose," Sam said finally. "After 20 years of guilt, they gave me a reason to keep living." Joseph placed a hand on his shoulder. "And now you give them permanence in the living world. Their story continues through you." As the sun set behind the mountains, Sam joined the families in the blessing ceremony for ground that had been desecrated but was now sacred again. He was no longer the isolated veteran who had found a supernatural girl in his stable. He was a witness, a storyteller, a keeper of truths that transcended death itself. The children were gone, but their legacy lived on in him, and that was enough. Chapter 18, The New Beginning. 1 year later, Sam Hartwell stood in his kitchen, watching the sunrise paint the Glacier Valley peaks in shades of rose and gold. The coffee maker gurgled to life, a sound that had become ritual rather than routine. On the table beside his cup lay a stack of letters from across the country, each one addressed to the ghost whisperer but forwarded to him by Joseph, who served as unofficial gatekeeper for correspondence that arrived at the tribal offices. The letters came from everywhere. Grieving parents who believed their children were trying to communicate, law enforcement agencies dealing with cold cases involving sacred grounds, scholars researching the intersection of indigenous spirituality and criminal justice. Sam read every one, though he responded to few. Most people wanted him to be something he wasn't, a medium, a mystic, a bridge between worlds. He was simply a witness who had learned to listen when the dead demanded justice. The stable where he'd first found Luna had been converted into something between a shrine and a study. The walls held photographs from the memorial dedication, newspaper clippings documenting the federal trials, and copies of the legislation that now bore the children's names. But more importantly, it housed the beginnings of his real work, a comprehensive record of indigenous burial ground violations across the American West, documented with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to ranch management. Joseph's truck pulled up the gravel drive as Sam finished his second cup of coffee. The younger man had become something more than a friend over the past year, part research partner, part spiritual guide, part surrogate son to a man who'd lost his only child to distance and misunderstanding. Today marked the anniversary of the children's sacrifice, and they'd planned to visit the memorial together. "Morning," Joseph called, carrying a thermos and a familiar leather portfolio. "The family's asked me to bring these." Inside the portfolio were new photographs from the memorial site, images of children playing beneath the bronze figures, families picnicking on ground that had been restored to sacred purpose, teenagers learning traditional dances where mining equipment had once torn the earth. The healing was visible and ongoing. "There's something else," Joseph said, his tone carefully neutral. "A call came in yesterday from the FBI. Another case, this time in Nevada. Ancient burial site, missing persons, and some very scared federal investigators who've heard about what happened here." Sam studied the photographs, seeing Luna's face reflected in every child who now played safely on consecrated ground. The children's sacrifice had achieved more than justice. It had created a template for protection, a precedent that made desecration costly and dangerous for those who would profit from indigenous suffering. "They want us to consult?" Sam asked. "They want you. But I think—" Joseph paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think the children would want both of us. The living world needs witnesses who understand both sides, the grief of the survivors and the traditions of those who came before." As they drove toward the memorial, Sam felt the familiar weight of purpose settling across his shoulders, not the desperate, guilt-driven need for redemption that had consumed him for 20 years, but something sustainable and chosen. The children had given him forgiveness, but more importantly, they'd given him a way to transform his survival into service. The memorial site buzzed with quiet activity. Mary Crow Feather tended the sacred fire, while other elders prepared for the anniversary ceremony. Children who hadn't been born when Luna died played between the bronze figures, their laughter echoing across ground that had absorbed too much sorrow before being reclaimed for joy. "Mr. Hartwell," Mary called, her face creasing into the kind of smile that spoke of peace earned through suffering. "Come. We saved a place for you." Sam took his position in the circle of families and friends, no longer an outsider but not quite an insider either, something else entirely. A witness, a bridge, a living reminder that justice could transcend the boundaries between worlds if someone was willing to listen when the dead demanded truth. As the ceremony began, Sam felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the simple knowledge that he belonged somewhere, serving a purpose larger than his own pain. The children were gone, but their work continued through him. Their sacrifice had purchased not just justice, but transformation, his own, and that of everyone who learned their story. When the sacred fire was lit and the prayers began, Sam closed his eyes and listened. Not for ghostly voices or supernatural manifestations, but for the living echo of children who had chosen courage over safety, justice over peace. Their legacy burned in the flames before him and in the work that stretched ahead, years of advocacy, investigation, and witness-bearing that would honor their memory by protecting others. Luna's final words had promised him enough, but sitting here among the families whose children had saved his soul, Sam Hartwell discovered something better than enough. He'd found home. The new beginning wasn't an ending at all, but a door opening onto purpose that would sustain him for whatever years remained. And that was everything.